Walking Dead, Season 2 predictions. The survivors gathered in the early morning light, their breaths rising like ghosts in the cold air. They had spent the night around a dim campfire, whispering their fears and hopes as the distant groans of walkers echoed through the forest. With the farm behind them and an uncertain road ahead, each person carried the weight of their own predictions, of what horrors, or salvation, lay in store. Rick tightened his grip on his revolver, standing watch at the edge of the group. The leader's burden was heavy on him, but it was nothing compared to the unspoken question: how long could they survive like this? The answer, if there was one, lay somewhere on the road ahead. We can't keep moving without a plan, Shane muttered, pacing back and forth. His voice was gruff, his words sharp. We need a base. A place to settle down before winter hits. You mean like the CDC? Daryl retorted, leaning against a tree with his crossbow slung over his shoulder. Yeah, 'cause that worked out real well. His sarcasm was a thin veil for his own unease, but he wasn't the only one doubting Shane's suggestion. Laurie stood close to Carl, her protective instincts stronger than ever. She glanced at Rick, but he avoided her eyes. They both knew the unspoken truth. The group was splintering, trust fraying like an old rope. What about Fort Benning? Glenn piped up, his voice hopeful but hesitant. It's still far, but if the military's still there, it could be safe. Or it could be a death trap, Carol said softly, cradling Sophia's doll in her hands. Her voice broke as she continued, like everything else we've tried. Tensions rose as the group debated their options, voices overlapping, doubts taking root like weeds. But then Herschel spoke, his voice calm yet commanding. If we're to survive, we need faith. Faith in each other. Faith that we'll find something better. His words hung in the air, a thin thread of hope for the weary group. But even faith wouldn't fend off the walkers, or the growing shadows of mistrust among them. Predictions for the road ahead. As the group moved deeper into the unknown, each member silently braced for what was to come. If Season 1 taught them anything, it was that survival required not just strength, but unity. Yet, unity was a fragile thing, easily shattered by fear, secrets, and betrayal. Would Shane's growing jealousy and resentment toward Rick finally boil over? Would Daryl's rough exterior give way to the humanity buried deep within? And what of Glenn and Maggie's budding relationship? Could love truly survive in a world so broken? Hints of a larger threat loomed on the horizon. Whispers of a fortified prison, a rumored safe haven, and even darker dangers yet to be revealed. The walkers weren't the only monsters left in the world, but one thing was certain: every choice they made, every step they took, would lead them closer to the truth, or to their own destruction. As the group disappeared into the misty forest, the camera panned to the road ahead, littered with abandoned cars and scattered belongings. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint sound of groaning in the distance. Season 2 promised more than survival, it promised transformation. For better or worse, none of them would remain the same. The highway stretched endlessly before them, a silent graveyard of rusting vehicles and shattered glass. Rick led the group cautiously, his eyes scanning for movement in the distance. They all knew by now, quiet didn't mean safety. Quiet was just the prelude to chaos. Behind him, Daryl took the rear guard, his crossbow held loosely but ready. He caught movement out of the corner of his eye, just a bird, startled from its perch on an abandoned truck. But the brief tension in his posture spoke volumes. They were all wound tight, like coiled springs, ready to snap at the faintest threat. The shadow of Shane hung back, walking alongside Laurie and Carl. His eyes flicked to Rick's back now and then, his jaw clenched tight. The tension between them had grown unbearable, an unspoken battle for leadership, and something far more personal. We don't even know where we're going, Shane muttered under his breath. Rick turned his head slightly, but didn't stop walking. We're going forward, Shane. That's all we can do right now. Shane scoffed, his frustration barely contained. Forward. To what? Another dead end. Another damn place that's crawling with walkers. You think that's leadership? Rick stopped then, turning to face Shane fully. The rest of the group halted, their eyes darting nervously between the two men. This isn't about leadership, Shane, Rick said, his voice low but steady. This is about survival. And if you can't see that, maybe you need to ask yourself why you're still here. The tension between them was palpable, and for a moment, it seemed like Shane might say something that could shatter the fragile balance of the group. But he didn't. He just turned away, walking off toward the side of the road. New dangers, new faces. As they continued down the highway, they spotted a plume of smoke rising in the distance. It wasn't the telltale black smoke of a burning building, this was thinner, almost like a campfire. Could be people, Glenn said, his voice tinged with both hope and caution. Or it could be trouble. Rick nodded, signaling for the group to stop. We'll check it out. But we do this carefully. Glenn, Daryl, you're with me. The three of them moved forward, leaving the rest of the group behind to take cover among the abandoned cars. As they approached the source of the smoke, they saw it. A small camp nestled in the woods, barely visible through the trees. There were people there, 3 of them. 2 men and a woman, all armed, all looking just as wary as Rick and his group. Not another step, one of the men called out, raising a shotgun. His voice was steady, but there was fear in his eyes. We're not looking for trouble, Rick said, raising his hands. We're just passing through. The woman stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. Passing through. Nobody's just passing through anymore. The standoff was tense, each side sizing the other up. But Rick knew they couldn't afford to make enemies, not if these people had something they needed. Foreshadowing the prison. After an uneasy exchange, the strangers eventually let Rick's group approach the camp. It turned out they were scavengers, living day by day, just like everyone else. But they had heard whispers, rumors of a place far from here. A prison, the woman said, her voice hushed as though speaking the word might summon danger. They say it's fortified. A safe haven. But who knows? Could be a myth. Or worse. Rick's mind raced. A prison could mean safety, thick walls, secure gates. But it could also mean a trap, or worse, a graveyard. We'll take the risk, Rick said finally, determination hardening in his voice. If there's even a chance it's real, we have to find it. The woman shook her head. You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts won't save you. The darkness within. As the group moved on, the seeds of the prison began to take root in their minds. It was a goal, a purpose, something they desperately needed. But the journey ahead would test them in ways they couldn't imagine. Shane's resentment simmered, threatening to erupt at any moment. Daryl's loyalties remained uncertain, though his bond with Carol was beginning to grow. Glenn and Maggie's relationship deepened, offering a rare glimmer of hope amid the darkness. And then there was Rick, trying to hold them together, even as he felt himself unraveling. Leadership was a burden he never wanted, but now he realized it wasn't just about guiding the group. It was about protecting them from each other, and from the demons inside themselves. As the group disappeared into the horizon, the camera lingered on a blood-stained sign by the side of the road. It read, "Hitchhikers may be escaping inmates." Season 2 was only beginning, but the real battle wasn't just against the walkers. It was against the darkness within. What direction should we take next? Should we focus on the discovery of the prison, a specific character arc, or the looming Shane versus Rick conflict? A rift in the group. The journey toward the rumored prison wasn't smooth. Tensions bubbled beneath the surface, threatening to tear the group apart. Shane, now an outlier in his own mind, had begun whispering doubts to anyone who would listen. He cornered Andrea one evening as the group settled for the night. "You've seen it," Shane said, his voice low but insistent. "Rick's making decisions like he's got all the answers, but how many of us have died already following him?" Andrea hesitated, the weight of her grief for Amy still heavy on her heart. What are you saying? I'm saying we need to think about what's best for us, not just Rick's family. This group doesn't need a hero. It needs someone who knows how to survive. Andrea didn't respond, but the doubt Shane planted began to grow, quietly fanning the flames of division within the group. The signs of the prison. The first signs of the prison appeared one morning as the group trudged through an overgrown road. Daryl spotted it first, tall fences rising in the distance, barely visible through the haze of the early morning fog. Looks like we might have hit the jackpot, Daryl muttered, lowering his crossbow as he squinted at the outline of the structure. Rick stepped forward, the sight of the prison igniting a faint spark of hope in his chest. We'll scout it first. Make sure it's secure before we move in. But Shane, standing off to the side, scoffed. Secure? It's a prison, Rick. You think it's gonna be walker-free? Rick ignored him, addressing the rest of the group. This could be what we've been looking for. We'll do this carefully. No risks. No unnecessary losses. The group exchanged uncertain glances, but followed Rick's lead. It was the best plan they had, and for some, the only plan. Clearing the prison. The gates to the prison stood ajar, swaying slightly in the wind. The group approached cautiously, weapons at the ready. The eerie silence was broken only by the occasional creak of metal and the distant caw of crows. Rick, Glenn, Daryl, and Maggie took point, stepping through the gates and into the prison yard. What they saw sent chills down their spines. Scattered bodies, both human and walker, littered the ground. The rusted remains of barbed wire fences and abandoned guard towers loomed overhead, casting long shadows in the fading light. We'll clear it section by section, Rick said, his voice firm. Stay close. Watch each other's backs. The group moved as one, clearing the yard and entering the first building. Inside, the air was thick with decay. The flickering light of their flashlights revealed the carnage left behind, prisoners and guards who had fallen to the outbreak. They made it through the first few corridors without incident, but as they entered a larger room, the low, guttural groans of walkers filled the air. Here we go, Daryl muttered, raising his crossbow. The fight was brutal and chaotic, the confined space making it difficult to maneuver. But the group worked together, their trust in one another outweighing the tension that had been building. When the last walker fell, they stood in the silence, catching their breath. This could work, Glenn said, his voice tinged with hope. We could make this a home. But not everyone shared his optimism. Shane stood near the back, his face unreadable. To him, the prison felt more like a tomb than a sanctuary. Foreshadowing new threats as the group settled into the cleared section of the prison, they began to explore their surroundings. Rick insisted on dividing the prison into safe zones, areas they could secure and expand into as needed. But even as they started to establish some semblance of normalcy, cracks in their unity grew deeper. Shane's resentment toward Rick reached a boiling point one evening as they argued over how to handle their dwindling supplies. You're gonna get us all killed. Shane shouted, his voice echoing through the empty halls of the prison, and you think you can do better? Rick shot back, his patience worn thin. The confrontation ended in silence, but the tension between them was like a ticking time bomb. Meanwhile, Carol found herself drawn to Daryl's quiet strength, and Maggie and Glenn's bond continued to deepen. But amid these glimmers of humanity, the group began to sense that they weren't alone in the prison. Strange sounds echoed through the corridors at night, footsteps, whispers, and the occasional clang of metal. At first, they thought it was just their imagination. But as the days passed, it became clear. They weren't the only ones living in the prison. The stage was set for the arrival of a new threat, one that would challenge their very notion of survival. The prison's hidden dangers. As the group settled into the first cleared cell block, exhaustion overtook them. The concrete walls provided a grim sense of security, better than the open road, but far from comforting. That night, for the first time in weeks, some of them slept without fear of a walker attack, but the whispers began. Carol was the first to hear it, soft, almost inaudible murmurs drifting through the cold, empty halls. She brushed it off as her imagination, a side effect of fatigue and grief. But then Maggie heard it too, faint voices just beyond the barred windows. What if it's other survivors? Maggie whispered to Glenn as they lay on the hard metal bunk. Or worse, Glenn replied, his grip tightening on the machete he kept close. By morning, it wasn't just whispers. A clanging sound echoed from deeper within the prison, like metal scraping against stone. Rick called a meeting, his voice steady, but his expression grim. We can't ignore this, he said, looking at each member of the group. If there's someone else here, alive or dead, we need to find out. And we need to deal with it. Shane crossed his arms, leaning against the wall. Great. Another one of Rick's plans that's probably gonna get someone killed. Rick ignored him, assigning teams to explore the unexplored sections of the prison. Shane, reluctantly, was paired with T-Dog, while Rick led a group with Glenn and Maggie. Daryl insisted on going alone, his instincts sharp as ever, discovering the past. The deeper they ventured into the prison, the more unsettling it became. Bloodstains smeared the walls, old and dried, but still a haunting reminder of the chaos that had unfolded here. Rooms full of overturned furniture and hastily abandoned belongings told stories of inmates and guards who had tried, and failed, to escape the outbreak. Daryl, in his solitary search, found something that gave him pause. A pile of bodies, clearly human, but not walkers. They'd been executed, shot in the head, their hands bound. Looks like someone cleaned house, he muttered, his voice echoing in the empty room. He left the grim discovery behind, deciding to keep it to himself until he could make sense of it. Meanwhile, Rick's group found a room full of locked cells. One of them rattled faintly as they passed. Glenn froze, his flashlight trembling slightly as he shone it on the barred door. What the hell? Glenn whispered. The group moved cautiously closer. Inside the cell was a walker, its decayed hands clawing at the bars. But what made their blood run cold was the writing scrawled on the wall behind it. They are still watching. The prison's inhabitants. By the time the groups regrouped in the cleared cell block, unease had settled over everyone. Each team had found something. Signs of other survivors, of deliberate violence, and of something much worse. They're not walkers, T-Dog said, his voice low. Whoever's in here with us, they're alive. And they're dangerous. Rick nodded, his expression hard. We secure what we can. We don't take any chances. But Shane had had enough. Secure what, Rick? You saw what we're dealing with. This place isn't safe. It's just another trap, like everywhere else. This is our best shot, Rick snapped, stepping closer to Shane. We're not running again. Not until we know what we're dealing with. The two men stared each other down, the tension between them threatening to explode. But before it could, a piercing scream echoed through the halls. The group froze. It was Laurie. A new enemy. They ran toward the sound, weapons drawn, finding Laurie standing near the door of the infirmary. She was unharmed but pale, pointing toward the room. Inside, a man sat slumped in a chair, his face gaunt and hollow. He wasn't a walker. He was alive. Who are you? Rick demanded, stepping forward cautiously. The man raised his head, his eyes wild with fear. You shouldn't be here, he rasped. You have no idea what they'll do. Who? Rick pressed. Who's here? The man laughed bitterly, a sound that sent chills down their spines. The guards, he said. They never left. Before anyone could respond, the sound of heavy footsteps filled the hall. A group of armed men emerged from the shadows, their uniforms tattered but recognizable as prison guards. This is our prison, their leader growled, leveling a shotgun at Rick. And you just walked into your own graves. The battle for control, the next chapter of their survival, had begun, and it wasn't just about walkers anymore. The group now faced a new enemy, the guards, Hardened survivors who had claimed the prison as their OWN.as the survivors prepared for a confrontation, lines were drawn within their own group. Shane's dissent grew louder, his desire to take control stronger. Daryl's discovery of the executed prisoners weighed heavily on him, while Carol's quiet strength began to emerge, as she stepped up to protect the group. And through it all, Rick struggled to hold the group together, knowing that the real danger wasn't just the guards or the walkers. It was the fractures forming among their own. The prison was supposed to be their sanctuary. Now, it was a battlefield.